The rain fell steadily on the cracked highways of what was once bustling Texas territory, washing over abandoned vehicles, toppled road signs, and forgotten bags. The skies had stayed gray for days, mirroring the country's mood, broken, uncertain, and silent. From coast to coast, America had been reduced to clusters of isolated human pockets, each fending for survival in their own way. The real danger, however, wasn't just the undead, it was disunity. In the small town of Holly Ridge, a group of about 40 survivors had fortified an old high school. Tall fences made of scavenged metal, guard towers crafted from buses, and a rotating watch crew made it one of the more secure outposts. But even inside those walls, peace was fragile. Factions had formed, those who believed in helping outsiders, and those who didn't. The undead roamed the nearby woods and highways, but it was human distrust that threatened to break everything apart. 17-year-old Max Callahan stood on watch duty, his eyes fixed on the tree line beyond the southern wall. He had never seen the world before the fall, only read about it in salvaged textbooks. Raised on survival, Max was fast, observant, and skeptical. His partner on the wall was Reina Castillo, a former EMT and one of the oldest in the community at 36. She was practical, driven, and one of the few who still believed in the old world's idea of working together. "You see that?" Max asked, pointing toward the distant tree line. Reina squinted. At first, it looked like a deer. But the way it moved, limping yet fast. Then another followed, and another. 3 figures, erratic in their movements, stumbling through the mist. Not human. Not anymore. "Zeke's," she whispered, reaching for her radio. Just as she pressed the call button, a flare exploded in the distance, green. It was a signal. Someone needed help. Max tensed. "That's not one of ours." "No, it's not," Reina replied. "But it's someone." Back inside the high school, the makeshift council, 5 individuals who made decisions for the community, argued heatedly over what to do. Councilman Briggs, once a sheriff, was adamant. "No outsiders. No exceptions. Every stranger we let in weakens our supply lines." But Dr. Lena Monroe countered with urgency. "If they have that flare, they might have training, supplies, maybe intel on other communities. We're stronger together." That was the word that made some people scoff, together. It felt like a relic from before. Still, with the threat growing outside and the signal too close to ignore, the council reluctantly allowed a team of 3 to investigate. Reina volunteered instantly. Max was assigned as backup, despite his youth. Rounding out the team was Eli Rhodes, a former park ranger with expert tracking skills and nerves of steel. As night began to fall, they set out with quiet urgency. The landscape outside was ghostly. Birds no longer sang. The trees stood still, as if afraid to move. Miles passed in silence, broken only by radio check-ins. Then they found them, 2 survivors, a man and a woman, hiding under a collapsed bridge, surrounded by the mutilated corpses of at least 5 undead. The woman was injured, her legs swollen and bleeding. The man, a soldier by the look of him, held a crude spear, eyes sharp. "I'm Sergeant Will Graves," he said cautiously. "This is Ava. We've been running for 2 days. Our camp was overrun. We lit the flare 2 hours ago." Max studied the man. He looked exhausted but calm. His eyes flicked to Reina. "You folks always take this long?" "We almost didn't come," Reina admitted. "Most places don't anymore." Sergeant Graves nodded slowly. "Can't blame them." As they made their way back to Holly Ridge, Max noticed the soldier's awareness of the terrain, how he listened, how he scanned without being obvious. Whoever he wasn't a burden. Maybe Dr. Monroe had been right. They were only a mile from the wall when the first howl echoed from the hills. Then another. Not human. Not quite animal either. Eli froze. That's not a normal Zeke. What burst from the shadows wasn't slow. It was a new breed, faster, more coordinated. It lunged toward Ava, and Max tackled it just in time, both of them tumbling into the grass. Raina fired twice, hitting the creature in the head. It shrieked before collapsing into a twitching mess. More followed. The group sprinted for the wall, radioing ahead. Spotlights turned on. Gunfire erupted from the watchtowers. The horde wasn't massive, but they were smart. Organized. Dangerous. Just before the gate closed, Max looked back at the chaos and realized something: the dead were evolving, and fast. Inside the walls, the mood shifted. The threat had changed. The old rules didn't apply anymore. If they wanted to survive, the people of Halley Ridge had no choice. They had to unite, or fall, one divided group at a time. To be continued in Part 2. Let me know when you want Part 2 or if you'd like a full outline of all 8 parts in advance. You said. The heavy gates of Halley Ridge slammed shut behind them, and for a moment, the world outside was muffled, its horrors sealed away by metal and concrete. The survivors, already weary, made their way through the dimly lit hallways of the school. Max felt the weight of their uncertain future press down on his shoulders. Ava was being tended to by Dr. Monroe, her injured leg bandaged, while Sergeant Graves stood by, leaning against a locker. His eyes scanned the room as if assessing every face, every movement. He didn't trust easily, and Max couldn't blame him. They had all seen what happened to the innocent, the desperate, those who let their guard down. "You're lucky to be alive," Raina said, her voice calm as she worked on Ava's leg. "We don't get many survivors around here." Ava's eyes fluttered, a faint smile curling on her lips. "Lucky? We've been running for days, fighting the dead and, worse. You're the lucky ones. You've got a place to hold out." Sergeant Graves gave her a sharp look but said nothing. He was a man of few words, but every gesture spoke volumes. Max could see it in the soldier's eyes. He was sizing them up, weighing the risk of whether or not to trust them. The air in the room thickened as the realization dawned: the very idea of letting outsiders into their fragile sanctuary was already putting the community at risk. Meanwhile, the council convened in a nearby room, the weight of their decision looming over them like a storm cloud. Max, despite his youth, knew something was wrong. There were too many eyes glancing around, too many hushed voices. And somewhere deep inside, Max could feel it, a growing divide. Councilman Briggs was already speaking, his voice firm and authoritative. "We cannot afford to keep taking in every stray survivor. Look at what just happened. We let them in, and now we're exposed. Do we really want to risk our resources on people we don't know? The dead are out there. Our food supply is running low." Dr. Monroe's response was swift, almost desperate. "If we don't take risks, we'll all die here. We need information, allies. We can't survive this alone anymore. Look at them, they've got skills, knowledge. They've been out there, they've seen things. Maybe they can help us." Graves stood silently, arms crossed, his face betraying little emotion. He wasn't here to get involved in local politics. He was here to survive, to protect Ava, and to find a place where they could regroup. Max could sense that much. But what about the rest of the world? Were they all as divided as Halley Ridge? Or were there other communities willing to unite? Max's attention snapped back to the room as the council members continued to argue. He could feel the building tension, the uncomfortable truth hanging in the air: they were running out of time. Finally, Briggs stood up, his eyes cold and resolute. "We'll hold a vote. Everyone who's still alive here has a say. But make no mistake, we need to be smart. Trust is a commodity we don't have anymore." The vote was a formality, a way to appease both sides, but Max already knew how it would go. The fear of outsiders, of the unknown, was too great. Unity was an ideal, but trust had become a luxury no one could afford. Later that night, as the wind howled outside and the streets were bathed in the dim glow of lanterns, Max found himself walking the perimeter of the school. He had never been a fan of politics. All he knew was that survival was about action, not words. And right now, the walls of Halley Ridge felt less like protection and more like a prison. The undead were evolving, becoming more than mindless, stumbling creatures. They were learning, adapting. Max's thoughts were interrupted when Reyna appeared beside him, her figure illuminated by the pale light of a lantern. "You're thinking too much," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "I can't help it. It feels wrong." "We're all on edge, ready to snap," Max replied, his voice tinged with frustration. "And those creatures, they're different. I don't think we're prepared for what's coming." Reyna nodded, her expression hardening. "No one is. But if we don't keep our heads together, we're done. Trust might be fragile, but unity is the only weapon we have left." Max stared out into the night, the eerie stillness outside echoing the tension within. The Horde, whatever it was becoming, was only part of the threat. The real enemy was what lurked inside the walls of Halley Ridge: fear, doubt, and the deepening divide between those who still believed in unity and those who didn't. He couldn't help but wonder if the cracks in their fragile peace were already too deep to mend. The next day, the vote was cast, and as expected, it was a tie. The survivors were split down the middle, with half siding with the idea of opening their doors to Sergeant Graves and Ava, while the other half demanded they be left outside. Max found himself caught in the middle, between the conflicting sides of the community. But the tiebreaker vote fell to Reyna, and after a long pause, she stepped forward. "Open the gates," she said quietly. "But we watch them. We watch everyone. There's no room for mistakes anymore." With that, the gates were open once more. But the uncertainty that came with their decision lingered. Would the new arrivals prove to be the allies they hoped for, or would they bring about the fall of everything they had worked so hard to protect? As the gates creaked open, Max couldn't shake the feeling that they had just crossed a line. There was no going back now. To be continued in Part 3. The decision had been made. The gates of Halley Ridge were open, and Sergeant Will Graves, along with Ava, had been allowed entry. The unease among the survivors was palpable. Whispers spread like wildfire, and every passing moment seemed to stretch, filled with unspoken tension. They had accepted the outsiders, but at what cost? The community had been divided, and now, nothing felt certain. Max couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing just below the surface. He had seen it before in the eyes of those he'd grown up with: fear, distrust, and a desperate need to survive. But survival often came at a price, and he wasn't sure if Halley Ridge could afford it anymore. Days passed, and the gates remained open, but the uneasy truce between the factions of the community grew more fragile. Reyna and Max took their usual shifts on the wall, watching for any sign of movement from the undead. As the weeks dragged on, it became clear that the creatures outside were becoming more coordinated. They no longer wandered aimlessly. They hunted in packs, and the way they moved had changed. They were smarter, faster, more dangerous. Max was sure they had evolved in some way, and they weren't the only ones. But even more unsettling was the growing rift inside Halley Ridge. It wasn't just the presence of the outsiders that caused discomfort. The real problem was that some of the survivors, those who had been living in the school before Graves and Ava arrived, began to question the decision to allow strangers inside. How could they trust them? What if they were spies from another community, come to infiltrate and take what was left of their dwindling supplies? And more importantly, who else had managed to survive the apocalypse? One evening, as Max stood near the south wall, watching the tree line for any signs of movement, he overheard a conversation between two men from the council, Samuel and Jace. Their voices were low, but their words cut through the night air like a knife. "I'm telling you, Samuel, we made a mistake. They're not what they say they are. I've been watching them. That soldier? He's hiding something." Samuel's voice was filled with caution. "You don't know that for sure. We've all seen what's out there, Jace. We need all the help we can get." "Help? They're a liability. If they weren't part of a bigger group before, they're probably trouble," Jace shot back, his tone sharp. "What if they're just a distraction? If we keep them around, it'll be the end of us. I'd rather face the dead than someone like them." Max's hand tightened around the rifle slung over his shoulder as he stepped closer, wanting to get a better sense of where their suspicions were coming from. Think it through. If Graves wanted to take us down, he could have done it already, Samuel replied, his voice weary. But he didn't. They're just trying to survive, same as us. Maybe they'll help us fight back. I'm not so sure. I'll keep my eye on them. I don't trust Graves, and I never will. Max could hear the finality in Jace's voice as he walked away, leaving Samuel staring into the dark. The weight of the conversation settled heavily in Max's chest. Was there more to Graves than he had let on? Or was the fear among the survivors causing them to see threats where there were none? Later that night, Max couldn't sleep. His mind was racing, thoughts spinning like a whirlwind. He needed answers. He needed to know if they were truly safer with the outsiders or if they were walking into a trap. But trust was thin, and no one was talking about what had happened to the rest of the world, why the zombies had changed, why everything felt so much more dangerous. Max found himself in the makeshift command room, where the council members were gathered, discussing logistics, the safety of the community, and how best to fortify the outer walls. It was quiet, almost too quiet. Max walked in, hoping to catch a conversation, but all eyes turned to him as if they were expecting something. It was Raina who spoke first, her voice calm, but the tension in her eyes was clear. Max, you shouldn't be in here, she said, but her voice lacked the usual firmness. She was distracted, too. I overheard something. People are worried. They're suspicious of Graves and Ava. I need to know what's really going on, Max said, his voice low but filled with conviction. Is there something we're not being told? Raina hesitated before answering. There's a lot more at stake than just the dead outside. People are afraid of losing what little they have left. But this isn't just about Graves and Ava. It's about whether or not we can still make decisions as a group. If we don't unite, we'll fall. Not just to the undead, but to the fear, to the distrust. Max turned his gaze to the rest of the council. Their faces were drawn, tired, but they were watching him closely. It was clear that Raina wasn't the only one feeling the pressure. What's the plan? Max asked, his voice steady. Griggs, the leader of the council, spoke up. We're preparing to make a move. If we're going to survive, we need more supplies. The undead aren't the only danger out there. The outside world is full of threats we can't even imagine. Max could feel the weight of the decision that was coming. Hallie Ridge wasn't just facing the undead. It was facing itself, its divisions, its secrets, its growing mistrust. The uneasy truce would soon be tested. And this time, it wouldn't just be the zombies that tore them apart. To be continued in Part 4. Let me know when you're ready for Part 4. The air inside Hallie Ridge had grown thick with suspicion, and every footstep seemed to echo with the weight of impending doom. Max couldn't escape the feeling that something was about to break, whether it was the walls of the school or the fragile unity they had left. As the days passed, the tension between the survivors reached a boiling point. Each argument, each whispered complaint only made it clearer, trust was no longer something they could afford. Early the next morning, the entire community gathered in the gymnasium. The high ceiling, once a place for cheering crowds at school events, now felt hollow, almost suffocating. A few flickering lights cast long shadows over the faces of the survivors, their expressions grim, their eyes haunted. At the front of the room stood Raina, alongside Griggs, Dr. Monroe, and a few other key members of the council. Max took his place near the back, alongside Ava and Sergeant Graves. The tension between them and the others was palpable. Graves, who had remained mostly quiet since their arrival, stood stiffly, his gaze unwavering as he surveyed the room. Raina addressed the group, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. We're here to make decisions. The situation outside is growing worse. The undead are more organized than we've seen. They're evolving. But we also have to deal with the situation inside these walls. The people are divided, and if we don't act fast, it won't matter what's outside. We'll tear ourselves apart. Max couldn't help but agree. The constant fighting, the mistrust, it was eating away at the very foundation of their survival. The others in the room were restless, muttering among themselves, their eyes darting from one speaker to the next. Max could feel their fear building. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about control. Who would lead? Who would have the power to make the decisions that would shape the future of Halley Ridge? Griggs stood up, his voice deep and commanding. We need a plan. The dead are getting smarter. And if we don't take the offensive, we'll be overrun. But we also have to be prepared for what's to come from within. We have to ask ourselves, can we trust everyone in this room? A murmur ran through the crowd. The question hung in the air, unspoken but understood. Max's mind raced. Could they really trust everyone here? He thought back to the conversations he had overheard, Chase's accusations, the doubt in Samuel's eyes. It wasn't just Graves and Ava who were under suspicion. Everyone was a potential threat. Everyone had something to hide. Dr. Monroe spoke next, his tone soft but filled with urgency. We have medical supplies, but not enough. We need to take risks, go further out. If we don't have food and medicine, we won't survive the winter. But we can't just send people out there unprepared. We need more weapons. We need more manpower. Griggs nodded. We're organizing a supply run. But we have to be strategic. We've seen how quickly things can spiral out of control. Max's heart raced. A supply run meant venturing into the unknown, into the heart of danger. The undead had grown more unpredictable, and with every day that passed, their numbers swelled. There was no guarantee that they would return, and even if they did, what would they bring back? More supplies? Or more chaos? Later that afternoon, Max found himself alone in one of the school's classrooms, staring out of a cracked window at the barren world outside. The wind whipped through the empty streets, sending bits of debris skittering across the pavement. The once bustling town of Halley Ridge was now nothing more than a ghost town, filled with echoes of lives that had been lost to the apocalypse. Max could still hear the laughter from years ago, the sounds of people who had no idea how fragile their world was. A soft knock on the door pulled him out of his thoughts. He turned to find Raina standing in the doorway, her face a mix of determination and exhaustion. We need to talk, she said, stepping inside. Max nodded, stepping away from the window and motioning for her to sit. He had known this conversation was coming. They were both walking a fine line, caught between loyalty to their people and the uncomfortable truth that the future of Halley Ridge was anything but certain. I'm worried, Raina began, her voice barely above a whisper. About everything. The supply run, the divisions in the group, and especially about the choices we have to make. Max crossed his arms, leaning against the desk. You're not the only one. We're at a tipping point. I can feel it. And I'm not sure if the supply run is going to make things better or worse. If we fail, the whole community will fall apart. Raina nodded, her eyes heavy with the weight of the decision they faced. I've been thinking about what Jace said. He doesn't trust Graves, or Ava. And I'm not sure I do either. There's something off about all of this. It's like they're hiding something. Graves doesn't talk much, but there's a coldness to him that doesn't sit right. Max was quiet for a moment, considering her words. He had noticed it too, the way Graves kept to himself, the way he always seemed to be watching. But was it just wariness, or was it something more? We can't afford to make enemies right now, Raina continued. But I also don't know how long we can keep pretending that everything's fine. We're running out of time. Max exhaled, the weight of it all pressing on him. Maybe the question isn't whether we trust them. Maybe it's whether we can trust ourselves. If we don't pull together, we'll never make it. Raina's gaze softened, and for a moment, the tension between them lifted. I hope you're right. I really do. Later that day, the council reconvened to finalize the plans for the supply run. Max and Raina sat in the back, observing as the discussion heated up. It was clear that the decision was going to be a difficult one. There were those who wanted to push forward, to take the risk and hope for the best. And then there were those who wanted to stay behind, to fortify their defenses and wait for the storm to pass. The supply run wasn't just about resources, it was about choosing a side, choosing how they would move forward in this fractured world. Max's mind was clouded with uncertainty. If they went out there, would they find what they needed? Or would they be walking straight into a trap of their own making? And most importantly, would they survive long enough to see the end of it? To be continued in Part 5. The decision had been made. Halley Ridge would embark on a dangerous supply run, the community's last hope for securing enough resources to survive the growing storm outside their walls. Tensions still lingered, but there was a collective understanding that this mission was no longer just about gathering supplies. It was about proving something, about showing that they could still stand together, even when everything around them threatened to tear them apart. Max couldn't shake the feeling that the road ahead would lead them straight into the unknown, into a place where nothing would ever be the same again. The morning of the supply run dawned cold and bleak. A thick fog clung to the ground like a suffocating blanket, making the world outside the gates of Halley Ridge feel like a distant, forgotten place. The survivors had gathered in the courtyard, preparing for the mission. Griggs and Reyna stood at the front, giving final instructions. Sergeant Graves and Ava stood to the side, ready to lead the convoy, their faces set in grim determination. Max felt the weight of the moment press down on him. He was going, whether he liked it or not. The community needed him, just as much as they needed each other. But the truth was, he wasn't sure what he was walking into. The undead were getting smarter, faster. No longer were they mindless, shuffling creatures. They were hunting in coordinated groups, and the landscape had changed. "We're going to need everyone to keep their wits about them," Griggs said, his voice firm. "We're venturing beyond familiar territory. We don't know what's waiting for us out there. Stay sharp, keep your weapons ready, and above all, don't take any unnecessary risks." Max nodded, checking his rifle one last time. The weight of it felt like a reassurance, a small comfort in a world that had long since lost any sense of security. Reyna turned to him before they left, her eyes intense. "Stay close. This is more than just a supply run. We need to stick together. If things go south, we need to know who we can trust." Max gave her a brief nod. He understood. Trust was everything now. Without it, they wouldn't stand a chance. The convoy made its way out of the gates, the sound of tires crunching against gravel the only noise breaking the silence. Graves led the way, with Ava beside him. Behind them, Reyna, Max, and the rest of the team followed in two vehicles, one a modified truck, the other a battered van that had seen better days. The road ahead was lined with overgrown weeds and the occasional abandoned car, the remnants of a world that had long since passed. The first few miles were uneventful, but Max couldn't shake the sense that they were being watched. Every rustle in the trees, every distant groan carried on the wind, set his nerves on edge. He wasn't the only one who felt it. The others were alert, scanning the horizon, waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. The further they drove, the more the landscape seemed to change. The small, quiet townships gave way to open fields, the remains of farms left to rot in the wilderness. The roads were cracked and crumbling, like the very bones of the world had begun to decay. And still, the silence stretched on, eerie and oppressive. Then, without warning, the first attack came. A screech tore through the silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of feet pounding against the earth. Max's heart leaped into his throat as a group of zombies, faster than anything they'd encountered before, emerged from the woods. They moved with purpose, their decayed bodies somehow stronger and more agile. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural hunger, their movements sharp and predatory. They weren't just mindless creatures, they were hunting. "Get ready!" Graves shouted, slamming the brakes on his truck. The convoy screeched to a halt as the first wave of zombies descended upon them. Max didn't hesitate. He jumped out of the van, his rifle raised, his eyes scanning for targets. Reyna was close behind, her machete gleaming in the dim light. The others followed suit, forming a defensive line as the undead charged. Max fired, his shots ringing out in quick succession. The zombies didn't flinch, they kept coming, undeterred. It was like they were drawn to the noise, the chaos, as if they knew this was their moment. A zombie lunged at Max, but he was quicker, sidestepping and delivering a precise blow to its head. It crumpled to the ground, but the movement only seemed to draw more from the surrounding woods. The group fought back, but it quickly became clear that this wasn't just an ordinary attack. These weren't the same slow, lumbering creatures they were used to. They were faster, more vicious, more strategic. In the chaos, Max's mind raced. Where were the rest of the zombies coming from? How had they coordinated so quickly? The group had only just entered the outskirts of the town, they hadn't even reached their first stop yet. He caught a glimpse of Graves, who seemed to be directing the attack with military precision. But even he looked surprised by the onslaught. Max shot again, narrowly missing a zombie that lunged for him. The creature was too fast, too close. He had to get out of the line of fire. Move back. Graves barked, signaling for the survivors to regroup. Get to the vehicles, now. Reyna slashed at another zombie, her blade cleaving through the air with brutal efficiency. She was relentless, but even she was starting to show signs of exhaustion. Max's heart hammered in his chest as he fought his way back to the van. The zombies were everywhere, too many, too fast. The convoy was in danger of being overwhelmed, and their only option was to retreat. Fall back. Everyone, get to the vehicles. Max yelled. As the group scrambled to climb back into the vehicles, Max glanced over at Ava and Graves. They had retreated toward the truck, but there was something off in the way they were moving, too deliberate, too controlled. Were they truly just fighting to survive? Or was there something else going on? Max's suspicions grew as the last of the survivors piled into the vehicles, the doors slamming shut behind them. The convoy sped away, leaving behind the carnage, but Max's mind kept returning to that question: what had just happened? And who, if anyone, could they truly trust? To be continued in Part 6. The convoy sped down the abandoned highway, the engines roaring as the survivors tried to distance themselves from the ambush. The sky above was a dull gray, mirroring the heaviness in the hearts of those in the vehicles. Max's hands gripped the seat in front of him, his mind racing. The attack had been unlike anything they'd faced before. The zombies had been faster, smarter, and more organized. Something was wrong, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Inside the van, tension was thick. Max sat next to Reyna, his eyes locked on the road ahead, but his thoughts were far away. The zombies they had encountered were unlike any they had seen before. They had coordinated their attack as if they knew exactly when and where to strike. It felt planned. Do you think this was an accident? Reyna's voice broke the silence, her tone low and thoughtful. Max shook his head. No way. That attack wasn't random. Someone knew we were coming. But who? Reyna met his gaze, her expression darkening. We need answers. And I don't think we're going to get them if we keep running. If this is what the world has become, we need to figure out how to fight back, not just survive. Max's stomach twisted. She was right. They couldn't keep retreating every time something went wrong. But right now, retreat was the only option. They had lost momentum, lost trust in each other. The group was fractured. As the convoy continued through the deserted townships, something in the distance caught Max's eye. The truck in front of them had slowed down, and the van followed suit. Max squinted through the windshield, trying to make out the figure standing by the side of the road. At first, he thought it was just another survivor, but the figure seemed different. A tall silhouette, barely visible through the mist, standing unnaturally still. Stop the van, Max ordered. Reyna raised an eyebrow but complied. The van skidded to a halt a few feet behind the truck, and Max immediately climbed out, his gun at the ready. The others were on edge, but they followed his lead. They couldn't afford to ignore a potential threat. As Max and the others approached the figure, they realized something was terribly wrong. It was a man, or at least it had been once. The figure was dressed in tattered clothing, and his face was obscured by a ragged mask, but his movements were too deliberate, too controlled for a mindless zombie. He wasn't alone. Behind him, hidden in the fog, Max could make out the faint silhouettes of more figures, standing like sentinels in the mist. Max's blood ran cold. These weren't just zombies. They were something else. "Who are you?" Max called out, trying to keep his voice steady. The figure didn't respond. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step forward, his posture stiff. Max raised his weapon, ready to react, but Reyna put a hand on his arm, stopping him. "Wait," she whispered. "Something's not right." Before Max could respond, the figure suddenly dropped to his knees, letting out a long, guttural scream. The scream echoed through the fog, bouncing off the empty buildings. It was a sound that sent chills down Max's spine. It was a scream of pain, but also of something much darker. Then, as quickly as it had started, the figure went silent. He stood again, but this time, his eyes, glowing with an unnatural light, focused on Max. "We know you're here," the figure said in a hoarse voice. Max froze. The voice wasn't human, not completely. It had a deep, rasping quality, like the voice of something far older than any of them. But it was clear enough. The figure wasn't just a lost soul wandering the streets, it was part of something bigger, something organized. "We've been watching you," the figure continued, his voice chillingly calm. "You think you can survive this apocalypse by hiding, by running? You're wrong. We're the new world. And you're either with us or against us." Max's grip tightened on his gun. He was ready to fire, but Reyna stopped him, stepping forward. "We don't want trouble," she said firmly. "We just need supplies. And answers." The figure tilted his head, as if considering her words. "Supplies?" he repeated, a twisted smile playing on his lips. "You think supplies will save you? No. What you need is unity. What you need is control." The rest of the group had gathered behind Max and Reyna, the tension in the air nearly suffocating. Ava and Sergeant Graves flanked them, weapons raised, watching the figure with distrust. But it was Griggs who spoke next, his voice low and steady. "What do you want from us?" Griggs demanded. The figure's smile widened, and for a moment, Max could almost see the remnants of a man beneath the eerie mask. The figure reached up and slowly removed the cloth covering his face. What was revealed sent a wave of horror through the survivors. His face was half decayed, an unnatural fusion of human and zombie features. His eyes burned with the same unnatural glow. And when he spoke again, his words sent a shiver through Max's spine. "We want you to join us. You can't survive alone, not in this world. The dead are changing. They're evolving. And so are we. There's a place for you in our ranks, if you're willing to accept it. But make no mistake, there's no going back." Max's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just about surviving the zombies. This was something far worse. It was a warning, and an offer. But it came with a cost, unity at the price of their freedom, their humanity. Reyna stepped forward, her voice cutting through the silence. "We don't trust you. And we never will." The figure's smile faded. "Then you are already lost." With that, he stepped back into the fog, his followers melting into the shadows. For a long moment, no one moved. Max turned to Reyna, his mind reeling. "What just happened?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've made a dangerous enemy," Reyna replied, her face pale. "And I think they were giving us a glimpse of what's to come." Griggs clenched his fists, his jaw tight with fury. "We can't let them control us. We need to stay united, no matter what." Max nodded, but the weight of the encounter lingered. They had just encountered something far more dangerous than zombies. They had encountered a new kind of threat. A force that was both undead and somehow more. As the convoy continued its journey, Max's thoughts turned dark. The world they knew had ended, but something new, something terrifying, was rising in its place. To be continued in Part 7. Let me know when you're ready for Part 7. The atmosphere was tense as the convoy pressed on, the figures from the fog still haunting Max's thoughts. The road ahead stretched into an uncertain future, filled with questions they had no answers to. The shadowy figure and his cryptic message echoed in their minds, unity at the cost of their freedom. The promise of something bigger, something more powerful, lingered in the air, like a noxious cloud that refused to dissipate. Max sat in the back of the van, his mind racing. What had they just encountered? It was clear that whatever this group was, they were far more dangerous than the mindless zombies they had been fighting for survival. This was organized, calculated, and it was a reminder that in a world gone wrong, humanity itself could be just as monstrous. The convoy finally came to a stop in a desolate, overgrown town, the next stop on their dangerous mission. The buildings loomed like silent sentinels, empty windows staring out like hollow eyes. Nature had begun to reclaim what humanity had abandoned, vines crawling up the sides of decaying structures, and streets that once bustled with life now eerily still. It was a ghost town in every sense of the word. "Get ready," Graves said, his voice low but commanding as he looked over the group. "This place may look abandoned, but that doesn't mean it's safe. We'll split up into teams and check the buildings for supplies." Max wasn't sure what he was expecting, but it certainly wasn't this. The place felt wrong. The quiet was unsettling, and even though the place appeared to be empty, Max couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Reyna stood beside him, her expression as grim as his own. "Something about this feels off." "They're here, I can feel it." Max nodded, his instincts screaming that danger was lurking just beyond the crumbling walls. But the mission was too important. They couldn't turn back now. The teams dispersed, moving carefully through the abandoned streets, weapons raised and eyes scanning for any signs of movement. Max and Reyna entered a dilapidated building that had once been a hardware store. The shelves were empty, save for a few rusted tools and forgotten remnants of the past. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay hung in the air, making Max's stomach turn. "We're not alone," Reyna whispered, her eyes narrowing as she peered into the shadows. Max didn't need to hear it twice. He was already on edge, every sense heightened as they moved deeper into the store. The sound of distant groans echoed faintly, but not from the typical slow-moving zombies they were accustomed to. This was different, closer, more purposeful. Suddenly, from the corner of his eye, Max saw a figure darting past one of the broken windows. He turned instinctively, raising his gun, but it was already gone. "Did you see that?" Max asked, his voice tight. Reyna nodded, her grip tightening on her machete. "They're here. We need to move. Fast." But before they could react, the building's entrance exploded with a series of rapid footsteps. A dozen zombies, faster, more coordinated than anything they had ever faced, rushed through the doorway, blocking their escape. Max fired, his shots echoing through the building, but they kept coming, relentless in their pursuit. The team had been right. This wasn't just an ordinary horde, it was organized. And they had been waiting for them. Outside, Griggs and the others heard the gunfire and quickly rushed to help. Max and Reyna fought side by side, their backs against the wall, as they tried to hold off the incoming wave of zombies. The creatures moved with unnatural precision, circling them, almost as if they knew exactly how to cut off every exit. Max's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the room. They needed to escape, but the only way out was blocked by the undead. "We can't stay here," Max shouted, slamming another round into a zombie's skull. "Reyna, move." Reyna didn't need any more encouragement. She pushed forward, cutting through the undead with swift strikes, her machete a blur of deadly precision. Max followed her lead, mowing down any zombies that got too close, his thoughts whirling. Then, without warning, the ground beneath their feet shook, and the building trembled as if something massive was moving below. "What the hell?" Max yelled, momentarily losing his footing. Reyna grabbed his arm, her eyes wide. "It's them. They're not just zombies, they're something worse." Suddenly, the floor collapsed beneath them, sending them both crashing into the lower level of the building. Max's head slammed against the concrete floor, his vision blurring for a moment. He groaned, disoriented, but Reyna was already up, pulling him to his feet. "Stay with me, Max," she urged, her eyes scanning the dark, crumbling space. The lower level of the building was a maze of steel beams and rubble, and the stench of death was thick in the air. "We need to find a way out," Max said, his voice hoarse. But the moment they tried to move toward the exit, more zombies emerged from the shadows. They didn't just shuffle aimlessly, they attacked with speed and precision, cutting off their escape routes. Max and Reyna backed into a corner, fighting for their lives, but the odds were stacked against them. It was clear that they weren't just dealing with a horde, they were facing an organized, intelligent force. And they were outnumbered. Suddenly, the sound of a vehicle engine roared outside, followed by the rapid gunfire of Sergeant Graves and the others. The door to the lower level burst open, and Griggs, Ava, and the rest of the team poured in, guns blazing. The zombies were quickly overwhelmed by the onslaught of firepower. Max and Reyna barely had time to catch their breath before the team had cleared the room. "We need to go. Now!" Griggs shouted, already pulling them toward the exit. As they sprinted for the door, Max glanced back, his mind racing. The zombies weren't just mindless killers anymore. They were evolving, growing smarter. And if this new threat was anything like what they'd seen so far, the war for survival had just entered a far more dangerous phase. But there was something more pressing on his mind. As the team made their way back to the convoy, Max couldn't shake the memory of the figure in the fog. The one who had warned them that they were already lost. That warning, more than anything, lingered. The dead weren't the only ones they had to worry about anymore. To be continued in Part 8. Let me know when you're ready for Part 8. The convoy sped away from the ruins of the desolate town, the tension thick in the air. Max could feel his pulse racing as his thoughts collided with the events that had just unfolded. The town, once a faint hope for supplies, had turned into a battlefield, a reminder that the fight for survival wasn't just about zombies anymore. There was something far more sinister at work, something that was using the undead as pawns. The group had survived the nightmarish onslaught, but Max couldn't shake the feeling that they were being herded into a trap. The shadowy figure from the fog, the one who had whispered about unity and power, loomed over him like a dark omen. What did they want from them? Why had they been allowed to escape? Max's mind churned with unanswered questions. The convoy pulled into an old, fortified military base at dawn. The once imposing gates now seemed like a final refuge, but Max couldn't shake the feeling of unease. As they entered the compound, the familiar sight of armed guards and high fences provided a brief sense of security, but it was fleeting. Everyone, including Graves and Reyna, had their guard up. They knew better than to trust anyone in this world. "This is as safe as it gets for now," Graves muttered, eyes scanning the surroundings. "We'll stay here and regroup." Max nodded but didn't feel any safer. The events at the hardware store were a clear sign that they had crossed into something far more dangerous than simple survival. These zombies were no longer mindless killers, they were evolving, and someone, or something, was pulling the strings. Later that evening, Max sat with Reyna in a small, dimly lit room inside the base. The walls were covered with maps of the region, each marked with red XS in various locations. The once vibrant base now felt more like a holding cell, a temporary shelter before the storm. "Do you think we're safe here?" Max asked, his voice low. Reyna glanced at him, her expression grim. "I don't know. But I know we need to be ready. The zombies aren't the only enemy we're up against. That group in the fog, they're the real threat." Max nodded, rubbing his temples. He had seen too much to pretend that everything was fine. The world had changed, and they were no longer just fighting for survival against the undead. The real battle was against those who saw the apocalypse as an opportunity to control what was left of the world. The next morning, as the convoy prepared to leave, a figure appeared at the gates of the base. It was the shadowy figure from the fog, the one who had spoken of unity and power. Max's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the man who had led them into this chaos. "You're too late," Max called out, stepping forward, anger and fear flooding his chest. "What do you want from us?" The figure's smile was cold, and he stepped into the light. What I want is for you to join me. The war is just beginning. The dead are only the first wave. It's the living who will make or break this world. Max felt a chill run down his spine. You're insane, he said, his grip tightening on his weapon. We're not joining you. You misunderstand, the figure said, his voice like a serpent's hiss. This isn't a choice. It's survival. There is no place for rebels in the New World Order. But you, he turned his eyes to Reyna. You could be the leader. The one to unite us all. Reyna stepped forward, her eyes burning with fury. We're not your puppets. We'll fight against you if we have to. The figure's eyes gleamed with amusement. Then you'll die like the rest. And the world will fall, piece by piece. Without another word, the figure disappeared back into the mist, leaving behind an unsettling silence. Max turned to Reyna, who was visibly shaken but resolute. We have to stop him. Whatever he's planning, it's not going to end well for any of us. Graves approached, his face a mask of determination. We're not letting him win. We'll find him, and we'll end this, no matter the cost. Max knew they were facing something far greater than a group of survivors trying to rebuild. This was a war for control, for the very future of what was left of humanity. But it wasn't just the zombies they had to worry about anymore. It was the people who would stop at nothing to create their own vision of a new world. The convoy left the base, heading toward the unknown, determined to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As they drove through the desolate landscape, Max thought of the road that had led them here. Every step had been filled with bloodshed, loss, and survival, but it had also been about something more. Unity. Trust. And the belief that they could fight for a future, no matter how dark it seemed. They didn't know what awaited them. But they knew one thing for sure, as long as they stuck together, they had a chance. The rising zombie threat was only one part of the nightmare they had to face. But the fight for their humanity, their unity, would be their greatest weapon. The end. This concludes the story, Dead America, when unity became the only weapon left against the rising zombie threat. Let me know if you'd like any changes or if you have another story in mind.